I really want to give a shout out to Vanessa and the whole team at Extreme Hangouts. The importance of conversations like this can't be understated. There's a statistic, when we talk about conversations and why they matter, and we talk about climate change, it's easy to assume that the whole world talk about this issue. And yet just 8% of households in America and many other countries will talk about climate change at any given point in time. It's part of the reason why 15 years ago, myself and a few other fellow students at Global Citizen, we were university student activists. We co-founded an organization called Global Citizen. We're now an international advocacy group. We work with some of the biggest artists in the world, from Coldplay through to Rihanna, through to many others. And over the course of that decade and a half, our audience of 12 million members has helped galvanize more than 33 million citizen actions. That's helped unlock $40 billion to, in some ways, touch and impact the lives of more than 1 billion people on the planet. And that's all been through the power of citizens using their voice. Now, people say to me, why did you get involved? In particular, structural change. We saw on the video someone talk about systemic change, talk about policy change. And that word, let's just unpack that for a moment, because people will talk about systems, they talk about policy, but to many people that doesn't mean anything. You see, when people ask themselves and they wake up in the morning and they say, I want to make the world a better place, the things that come to mind are, okay, I might donate to a charity, and that's important. They might say, I want to volunteer my time. Maybe I'm going to plant trees, and companies increasingly are engaging their employees, and that's all meaningful as well. They might say, I'm going to vote, and I'm going to vote for the planet, and I'm going to research, and I'm going to vote for those people who want to tackle climate change. And they might hold conversations around the dinner table. But I can guarantee you, for most people, policy change doesn't come to mind. It's not something you think about. It's not the first thing that comes on the radar. And there's many reasons why this is the case. And that's why part of the reason at Global Citizen, we sought to harness the power of popular culture. But it wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always the way in which we pursued change. My own story, people say, well, why did you get involved? I was born on the other side of the world, Perth, Western Australia, the most isolated city in the world. And when I was born, I went to primary school, and I wasn't really good at many things. I wasn't good at sport, and I certainly wasn't good at academics. I remember the start of high school, getting into class, and my teacher walking my mum through where I was ranked and saying, Michael, at this rate, isn't going to finish or graduate from high school, let alone get into university. And I thought, oh, who cares? I'm going to play PlayStation, do all these things. I don't care. So one day, I was there at school. We got told in, we said, okay, do an essay about a movie you really like. And the movie Gladiators had just come out with Russell Crowe. I thought, okay, I'm just going to write on this. Wrote this essay, didn't think anything of it. I got home, and my mum had this strange look on her face. She said, there's a message on the answer machine. And it was my year 8 teacher, Mr. Byrne, 24 years old. It was his first teaching gig. And he said to my mum, hi, Mrs. Sheldrick, I've noticed a change in Michael. Can you give me a call back? And I thought, well, that's a kind of slightly awkward and creepy message. What have I done wrong? And the reason why my mum had this confused look in her eyes, after years of people saying Michael's stupid, he's lazy, he's a loser, he's not going to amount to anything, this teacher had said, Michael somehow topped the class. We had no idea how he did it. And I think there's more to him than meets the eye. And the next day I go in and I see Mr. Byrne, and he goes, you may not believe in yourself, but I believe in you. And he challenges me. He says, if you work each day, I'll work with you. Let's do this together. Lunchtimes, recesses, after school, and I think you can be #1 by the end of the year. So I thought, what the heck? I may not believe in myself, but he is. Let's give it a go. So I go in, work really, really hard. And the last day of school, actually second day last of school, there I was sat on my lounge suite at home. And out of the driveway, suddenly this car approaches, and Mr. Byrne steps out. And I thought, what are you doing here, coming to my house, coming to see me? And with a very Australian way, he outstretches his hand, and he says, well done, mate. And he gives me this certificate with a number 1 on it. 5 years later, I finish high school, top 1% of my state, I can study anything, I get into law school. Suddenly people are like, oh, you're so smart, you're so intelligent. And I'm like, no, I'm not. No. Because I always remembered that kid at the start of high school that everyone thought was a loser, that couldn't kick a football in a straight line, let alone score a goal. And people laughing at me, and I thought, no, I don't. And I remembered the difference that teacher, Mr. Byrne, made in my life. And as I discovered more about the inequities of the world, the injustices that millions of children around the world, through no fault of their own, whether it's the lack of something as basic as a vaccine, maybe adolescent girls who have to drop out of school because of something as basic as a sanitary pad or napkin, I thought, okay, here's an injustice here, and I want to do something about it. So one thing which I discovered I was good at, one of my few superpowers, was my ability, and I think Vanessa and I probably have this in common, was our ability to shamelessly ask people for stuff for free. So I go around my old shopping center, I go to McDonald's, the equivalent of Starbucks. They give me all this free stuff, vouchers, everything. We do a quiz night at my old high school. We raise about $1,000, which we donate to go towards building a school in Papua New Guinea, just north of Australia. And then over my summers at winter, I travel to India, Bangladesh, Timor-Leste, and we quickly discover, okay, it's great. We've spent this money, we've built these schools, we've built these bricks, but then who's paying the teacher's salary 365 days a year? Who's paying for the meals every single day? Because that's often the only chance children will have to have a full, nutritious meal. And who's paying when their families get sick for that healthcare system? And then who's doing this in every town and community? And we quickly realized no amount of charity quiz nights or gala night dinners will raise the billions needed to end extreme poverty. So we came back to Australia, and that's where it was right on the cusp of social media, and that's where we harnessed the power of social media and also celebrity, musician, popular culture. We managed to convince the Australian government for the first time ever to double the amount of development assistance, resulting in $6 billion. And a few years later, when others came to us and said, that looks really good, you've cracked this model, they invited us to Central Park. We came to New York, and the thing we realized is when we walked in trying to tell people we want to bring this model to Central Park, you know, anyone that's worked in America will know that they say, oh, you know all that stuff you do in Australia or other parts of the world? That never happened. You're starting from scratch. But sure enough, we found ourselves on the great lawn of Central Park. We launched Global Citizen with 60,000 people, the likes of Neil Young, the Foo Fighters, and more than 10 years later, we've worked in countries and regions around the world. We're really excited right now in the lead up to COP30 next year in Brazil. In 2015, Coldplay performed, and they asked us, they challenged us. They said, listen, I'm not a CEO. Chris Martin said, I'm not a CEO. I'm not a business leader, but I'm not a politician. I'm not a head of state, but I do have music, and I do have my convening power. And he said, I'm going to work with you every year to take this model around the world. And Coldplay is now one of the most sustainable, I think they're the most sustainable acts and touring circuits of all time. And in 2021, and I know we have our friends from Reward, give everyone a wave. Reward do some amazing work, originally founded by Leonardo DiCaprio, and they work with indigenous communities in Brazil and many groups. And in 2021, we received this outreach from these communities. And they said, you know what's going on right now in the Amazon? You know, Bolsonaro and his administration are burning record levels across the Amazon. It's having a huge and negative impact. And we've given up. We're not even expecting the government of Brazil to come to the climate talks in Glasgow with a serious commitment. But what we are going to do is we're going to go to those governors. We're going to get them engaged in these issues. And what we're going to do with these governors is we're going to ask them to make commitments. There was only one issue. All of these NGOs had written to 6 governors across the Amazon, and none of them had replied. So they said, can you get Coldplay to tweet the governors? So go to Coldplay, and they say, okay. And we start putting out these tweets, Portuguese, different languages, and then we attach the letter and start tagging these governors in it. And then, of course, what do you think happened? The governors started replying and saying, we'll meet with these communities. And as a result of that, we got one of the largest commitments. I think it was the size of Rhode Island in the state of Pará in Brazil, and it was the only new area of protected land throughout the whole course of 4 years of Bolsonaro's time in power. And now we're working on an excited initiative to hopefully bring this next year to the Amazon, the road to Berlin, because there's so much devastation. The world needs about $8 to $9 billion to reforest the Amazon, and we can all play a role, and we can all do that. And $8 to $9 billion, it sounds like a lot of money, and in many cases it is. But $8 to $9 billion, it's also worth putting into perspective. I think something like the US alone spends $800 billion a year on its military and defense. This is a matter of priorities, and it's something we can do, and it starts with all of us. And so there'll be more news coming out on that. But one thing I also want to share is, as we were expanding Global Citizen, I would get these messages on social media, on LinkedIn, on Instagram. People would be writing to me, and they would be saying, how can we start our own campaigns? How can we launch our own policy approaches? How can we do this in our communities? And so I managed to put together this book, which I've recently published. It's called From Ideas to Impact. And it doesn't aim to have all the answers, but what it does do is aim to give people a start in their lives. And I went around the world and I interviewed community leaders making an impact on policy around climate change and other issues. And I identified 8 common steps that we can all use to make a difference when it comes to policy change. And one story I want to share is, we hear this concept of just transition, this idea of just transition. What does that mean? Well, you look around the world, let's take coal. We know that we have to wing in countries like Portugal and others, and the UK, Germany, South Africa, India, all of these countries that still rely on fossil fuels. We know we have to wean ourselves off our reliance on them. But we know when we look at coal, there's 2,400 coal plants around the world. And for every coal plant, there is a community around those plants. There are workers, there are people, in many cases, communities that for centuries have actually, going back to the Industrial Revolution, have had fathers, grandfathers working in coal mines, in power plants. They've literally built their livelihoods, their sense of identity of these towns. So the concept of a just transition is, how do you shift to renewable in a way that does not penalize these workers? Because one thing I know, if we seek climate action and it comes at the expense and we sacrifice people's livelihoods on the altar of climate action, we're never going to achieve our goals. And so this community I found was actually in Australia. And the reason why this community stood out to me is because in this town there was these trade union groups who had found a way to work with workers and the government to shut down their coal plants. And so I went in and I met with this labor union leader, this trade unionist. And this man, Steve, just to give you a picture, so you can picture him, he's bald, has a goatee, has tattoos all at his arm. He's worked for this trade union movement for a very long time, representing metal workers, representing steel workers, representing coal plant workers, mine operators, deep-seated passion. And yet in 2007, he tells me this story. He said, I remember watching Inconvenient Truth, and I saw then that the writing was on the wall. And I knew if we didn't have a viable roadmap for a world without coal, our community, whether we liked it or not, would still be punished, because he looked at Northern England and he looked at other stuff, and he says, when governments come push to shove, they're not great at planning, they will leave us all behind. And so he gathers everyone around this town, this community, in a town hall like this, and he announces to them, I want a plan for a world without coal. And you know what happened? Silent, much like you're all looking at me now. And then one person stands up and he goes, oh, Steve, you don't understand us. You must forget this town. You must forget where this is going. You must forget when you walk into a barbecue, the first thing someone says to you is, good day, mate. The second thing they say is they'll ask you about coal. He said, you forget that when a baby boy is born in this town, they get two things straight away. The first is their mother's milk, and the second is a lump of coal in their hand. And then everyone started cheering, saying, yeah, you're right. And Steve goes, that's when I knew I was losing the audience. And he said, in the end, he just decided to walk out. Everyone was cursing him. And literally like a fish, there was a parting. He said it was like I was toxic radioactive, and everyone parted for him. And he walked out, closed the door, could hear people cursing him. He goes, anyway, 5 years later, when the government suddenly started saying that maybe coal isn't economic affordable, the community asked him to come back. He said, like I was Nostradamus. And so he comes in, and together the community work on this process to government. And in the book, I tell the story of how, and I won't go into it because you have to get my book later today, and it's all in there. There's a shameless plug. But one thing I say is, it did actually occur to them, by the way, because someone asked, did they get Elon Musk's help? And they did think, do we go to Texas and try and meet with Elon Musk? And then they quickly dismissed that and said, no, there's more reliable ways of going about it. But May 2022 comes along. I'll tell you how it ends. Steve is standing at the back. It's the largest coal plant in Australia, one of the biggest emitters of carbon emissions, and the workers are all assembled. And the governor of the state comes along like this, and he announces to the community that the last coal plants will be fully closed down by 2027 and 2029, and everyone there will be at the job. Again, silence, and someone in the front row starts to slowly clap, and then the whole audience suddenly bursts into applause. And Steve said to me, that is a day, as I was standing at the back, that I would never forget. And he said, the ability for the Premier to come to town, give that announcement, and not be run out on the rails was because, alongside that, hundreds of millions of dollars had been put into the community. And when I went back in March this year, I actually saw them breaking ground on battery storage, harnessing the power of the workforce, the jobs, the skills, the transmission lines, and they were building the largest battery storage in the Southern Hemisphere that will provide more than 500 jobs for that community. And Steve said to me, just transitions, if they don't work, it's because they're not just. And governments often come in thinking they know the answer, but we wanted to own the outcome as a community. And there's many stories about why that happened, but at its core, the thing that they said was, this is not about jobs. This is about our home. There are many other stories I could share, but in closing, what I want to say is, in my book and what I outline, I talk about this concept of policy entrepreneurship. It doesn't aim to have comprehensive answers to every question, but what it does do is aim to give people a start. Because I honestly believe if you can get one person taking action, and then they share that with their friends and family, exponentially the momentum that comes from that can be extraordinary. We can make a difference because we have made a difference. And in the words of one of my heroes, Eleanor Roosevelt, who co-wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the best way to begin is to begin. So let's get started. Thank you all.